Web hosting. So we've talked about web servers up to this point quite a bit, and we've talked about Internet Information Services, which is the software that turns a server into a web server. It's the software that listens for these requests, turns them into actual pages, and delivers them to the browser. Right? So we've talked about all that. We haven't really talked about or seen how to configure a web server and how to really configure and manage Internet Information Services. So this nugget, we're going to focus entirely on Internet Information Services and how we can not only deploy our web applications and websites to Internet Information Services, but also how we can configure all the major components of IIS. Things like sites and what we call applications and virtual directories. Those are really the big components that make IIS and a web server what it is. Alright, so let's jump into the nugget here and start with the outline for it. And we're going to just first take a look here at web hosting and really just Internet Information Services overview. I want to get you familiar with those three components here: sites, applications, and virtual directories. Talk about their roles and responsibilities and get familiar with some of their configuration points. Because after that, we're going to jump right into IIS here and working with IIS and get familiar with how to create and configure each one of those components. And I want to go above and beyond here too. I want to get you familiar with how to configure ASP.NET. So there's a little trick I'll show you here using the ASP.NET_RegIIS utility that we can use to install and configure ASP.NET. So it's definitely not something that's going to be in the exam, but it's super handy to know, whether you're doing it at home on your local machine or in a production environment. Very, very handy utility to get the hang of. And also here, I did mention in a previous nugget, I'll show you where the ISAPI mappings are. So I'll take a look at the mappings and the filters and just show you some cool tips and tricks here in IIS. And finally, we're going to take a look at how to deploy our web applications from Visual Studio into IIS, and even not using Visual Studio. So I'll show you a couple of different ways that we can deploy our web applications and get them into our virtual directories on our web server. So whether people are, whether we're building an application for the intranet or the intranet, people can access our applications and our websites. All right, let's jump into web hosting here and start with an overview of IIS and web hosting in general here. Just talk a little bit about these three components. And before we even get there, we've looked up to this point at kind of everything prior to this, the request and response model. We've looked at how requests come in, how responses go out. We've even looked at the internals of how a page is processed and sent back as a response. We haven't looked at the gray area in between, and that's when the web server gets the request to when it finds the page. What happens in between? And that's really all done through the URL. So the URL is something like cbcnuggets.com/videos/programming/page.aspx. That's our fully qualified URL. And really all that is each one of these is in there. We have our sites, applications, and virtual directories that all construct the URL, and they all have their separate configuration points. For instance, at the very top level of the URL is the actual domain name. For instance, cbcnuggets.com. And if we were to mimic this in IIS, we would need to create a site, and we would call that site cbcnuggets.com. And really, a site's very simple, very basic. There's not a lot to it. It's really just a container. It starts off the hierarchy for everything that goes underneath it. But it does have a couple of important points, and that's going to be the bindings. And the bindings are really the configuration points. And really, all you have here is a binding protocol. So what protocol is used to access this site? HTTP or maybe HTTPS. And also a port. By default, obviously, it's going to be port 80, but you could also specify your own port. And then also the IP address. That's all the binding information. And optionally, host headers. And host headers, think of if you have multiple sites on here and we only had one IP address, it's a way to tie multiple sites to one IP address. So that's really all there is to a site, and I'll show you how we can configure a site here in Internet Information Services. We also have applications. And applications are just another way for us to group content or services. It also, again, forms part of the URL. So if we were to access this area, cbcnuggets.com/videos, although there'd be nothing in it, you wouldn't be able to access this by itself. And one thing I do want to mention here is we're going to kind of refer to this as IIS 7 theory, because it was a little bit different prior to IIS 7. In IIS 6 and before, applications and virtual directories were kind of the same object. You either had a virtual directory or you turned a virtual directory into an application. And really all that did is tied it to what's called an application pool. And an application pool just determines what, in .NET's case, what runtime or what version of .NET everything within the application runs under. And here's a good example of this. Say, for instance, we had another application called Services. And in here, maybe we had a web service under here. Maybe we had a catalog, for instance, of real-time data. When videos hit the wire, they go right into the catalog here so people can see them or preview them or whatnot. And this was built in the brand new version of .NET 4. But our old cbcnuggets.com website was built in, .NET 2. So applications gave us a way to, separate the runtimes. And so we could put anything, cbcnuggets.com could still run happily on .NET 2, where our services, our new web service, could run in .NET 4. And that's where the application pool is tied to the application. And an application pool just determines what version, in our case of ASP.NET, things underneath it run in. And finally, here we have virtual directories. And virtual directories are just a way to map physical directories and physical structures on the physical hard drive to these virtual directories. So, and this was a great way also to obviously hide, the physical representation where that file actually exists on the server from people who are accessing it through AUR. So it's really just a mapping. We could map and name a folder in IIS administration, but we would actually tie it to C:\websites/administration, and then all the pages underneath there would be available through the URL and the administration virtual directory. So we'll take a look at how to configure these, but that's really all it is. And it also, of course, forms part of the URL, the actual virtual directory itself. And all the files in the physical directory are then available through the virtual directory. All right, let's head over to Nugget Lab and take a look at how we can configure IIS, work with these three major components within IIS, and then we'll get into Visual Studio, deploy our web application into Internet Information Services, and access the application through a browser. All right, so let's minimize the whiteboard here. Head over to Nugget Lab. And once we're over here, we're going to head down to the Start button, head over to Administrative Tools, and within here you will see the IIS Manager, Internet Information Services Manager. If we click on this, it's going to open up the administration console. So the first place it takes us here is just the Start page. It gives us some quick links to tasks that we can do. And one of the big things you can do right off the bat here is manage the web server itself. So if we expand this, this contains all the objects we'll be working with here shortly. But if you were to do anything at this level, and you can see it just assumes the name of the current computer that we're on, which is DevNugget. If we right-click on it, we would be affecting all the sites on the server. So if we were to stop this right now, what it would actually do is stop the web server and stop the service that IIS runs under. All right, so, and you can see I did that. I actually clicked on stop. And now all of the sites underneath here are unavailable. But let's right-click on that and choose Start, and it'll actually just restart the service. So if you were to do anything at this level, it affects all the sites on the web server. And now over here on the right-hand side are kind of the settings. These are all the different settings that we can configure, kind of the category of the settings that we can configure at the server level. All right, so you can see there's ASP.NET settings, and then down here there are IIS settings. And we'll come back to this because it kind of applies at all levels. We can set these at the website level, at the the server level, pretty much any site, any level you can think of here. All right, so let me just refresh this because it didn't refresh the icon on our default website. There we go. We have to refresh the sites here to get the stop button off. But basically what we have here is we have application pools. This is what I was mentioning here. Here we have the classic .NET app pool that runs the .NET Framework version 2.0 in a classic pipeline. And then we have the default app pool in version 2.0 of .NET using the integrated pipeline here. And other than that, here we just have our websites. So underneath this folder is where we'll have all of our websites listed, and it comes with a default website with ASP.NET basically installed inside of it here. This is where ASP.NET 2.0 sits. And if we were to right-click and just look at the advanced settings here, this would show us that this website is hooked into the inetpub www-root directory, the physical directory. So think of this website even as kind of a virtual directory, even though it's not. It's just kind of where all the actual files start. In fact, if we go to Start, Run, C:\/ here, and go to inetpub, here's www-root. So if we were to put anything in here, any folders in here, any applications in here, they would show up underneath the default website as an actual folder. All right, so let's kind of make our own website here instead of work with the default so you can see how this stuff works. So let's right-click on Sites, hit Add New Website, and let's just call this site, how about nuggetlab.com. And if we want to select an app pool here, we'll just tie this to the default application pool. And then we can give it the physical path. And we're going to create our own here on the C drive. Let's just call this nuggetlab.com. Alright, we'll hit OK. And here is our binding information that we were talking about. So we have the type, we have the IP address, all unassigned. Just basically means any request that comes into here on port 80, this website is going to pick up and handle. Now, because we already have that here, we'll actually get yelled at if we click OK. It's going to tell us this binding already exists on the default website. So we could set up a host header down here, which we're not going to do because nuggetlab.com is already in use in the outside external world. So if we were to try to access NuggetLab from this server, to actually try to go out and find it. So what we're going to do is we're just going to tie this to port 81 for now. And then we'll hit OK. Now, if you need to access that information again here, we have these quick links over here in our actions area where you can access the bindings if you need to add more bindings or actually add a host name in there. There's our protocol, our host name, our port, our IP address. You can also configure the basic settings again here. At least you're kind of tied to the site name, although you can change it with an F2 on the actual name of the site up here. And you can also select the application pool and change the physical path if you need to. And you can also stop and start the website. Rather than at the server level, you can stop and start each website if you need to take it offline for whatever reason. Now let's get a virtual directory in here. So let's say that I've got a demos directory somewhere. So we want to access all these demos by going to nuggetlab.com/demos. But let's say that this demos directory maybe it's on another drive or another network share, and I'm just going to put it in the same directory, but not inside of nuggetlab.com. Let's say here that we've got a new folder called demos, and in here, let's just put one demo in here called 98-361_15, the current number of the Nugget video that we're on here in the series. Alright, so we've got this demos directory outside of nuggetlab.com. So what we can do here is right click on NuggetLab, choose add a virtual directory. We'll just give this the alias demos. That is going to tie to the physical path C:\demos and hit OK. And there we go. Now we have a virtual directory, and that automatically got pulled in here 98-361_15. Now here's the thing. We're going to deploy our web application to this folder. And what this needs to be then is an application. And we can actually convert this to an application right here. And I'm going to show you can actually also do this from Visual Studio. So let's not do this from here. Although it's easy to take it off, you can see we'll just do this. Convert to an application. You can tie it to its own application pool and hit OK. Something like that, right? So now it's an application we could deploy from Visual Studio. Visual Studio wouldn't yell at us. And if we wanted to, we could revert back to that by just right-clicking and choosing remove and hitting yes. That'll remove the application. Now if we tried to deploy to this directory through IIS, we would get yelled at. And actually, just to show you, let's head down to Start, open up Visual Web Developer 2010 Express, and I'm just going to open our web app project from a recent nugget, our web app nugget, and I'm going to right-click, choose Copy Website, and I'll go through this. And this just basically means it just automatically looks in our local host for this demos, doesn't find it. So I'm going to say no. And now if we connect, go to NuggetLab, demos, we want to deploy it into this directory, and hit open. Check it out. See that? The website is not marked as an application. Do you want to open it anyways? And let's say no for now and cancel out of this. We'll come back into here, and that'll work next time because if we right click, we're going to convert this back to an application, and now Visual Studio won't yell at us. But we'll get back to deploying there in a second. So the reason we need an application is because applications run under an app pool. And as we talked about here, the app pool just determines what runtime it runs under. So we kind of set this at the application and the website level. We set this at the website level, then anything underneath the website defaults to that app pool. And you can override it then at the application level. And we'll do that when we get our website in here, and I'll show you how to install ASP.NET, because the .NET Runtime version 4 is not installed. And you can see that by looking at the app pool here. We can see we only have version 2 installed. So we're going to need to get .NET version 4 installed, or our website will not work. Now, if we were to try to view our site right now, for instance, if we wanted to view nuggetlab.com/demos/90-361_15, we could right-click on it, go to Manage Application, and hit Browse, and it's going to take us right there on port 81, localhost port 81, demos, and then the name of our directory here. So it's accessing through the site, through the virtual directory, and then through our application, which is still, you can consider it, a directory because it still forms part of the URL. But it's telling us here that it's inaccessible because we're not allowing people to view the contents of this directory. And you can change that. If we go down to the settings, down here, where are you, directory browsing? There you are. See the directory browsing setting? If we double click on this, and we can actually enable this right here. So we click on enable. Now it's enabled. Now we can right click, manage view in the browser, and check it out. There it is. So, and you can we can't go to the parent directory because we only enabled browsing at this level right here. So let's disable this, and we could actually go all the way up to nuggetlab.com and enable directory browsing at this level. And now we could view our nuggetlab.com, manage website, hit browse. It'll take us right there. And again, we can only browse this. We can't go any deeper because we don't have directory browsing enabled anywhere else. So that's what I mean by you can configure each level here. This kind of applies to that level. Another thing I want to show you here, let me just turn directory browsing back off. We'll click on it down here in the IIS settings, double click on it, choose disable, and now we're back to normal. So some other things you can do here is in the ASP.NET configuration area, you'll notice a little spot down here for session state. And we talked about session state. If you double click on it, here are our options. By default, we have in process, and that just simply means in memory. Everything's in memory here and stored in memory. You can also do things like set up a state server where you store this on an actual server here. It'll store all the state on that server in that server's memory. You can also do a SQL server. If you want to store this data inside of a SQL Server database, you can set up the connection string here. And down here you have your cookie settings. Kind of neat, right? It's all stored through the session ID, as I mentioned in a previous nugget there. So you can configure that at the application level. If you try to do this on a virtual directory, everything's going to be grayed out because obviously we can't do that on a virtual directory. But if you do it, you can also do it at the site level itself, as you can see here, and that'll default everything else to this setting then. Now, some other settings we can work with, and then that's the ASP.NET level here. At the IIS level, just to show you here, we looked at directory browsing. I did want to talk about our handler mappings. See, these are all the mappings I was telling you about when we talked about the IIS API mappings in a previous nugget. Here are all the pages and what they can map to. So, for instance, if we go to ASPX here, we've got ASPX that are mapped to a variety of pages depending on the type of ASPX page coming in. For .NET 4.0, for instance, .NET 2.0. So if we double click on this, it's going to show us that it's going to the ASP.NET_ISAPI.dll in the version 2.0 folder of the .NET framework. We've also got one here for the 4.0 32-bit, 4.0 64-bit versions. So these are just the mappings to what handles the request based on the page extension. And then something else that we have here is down in the IIS settings is the actual IIS API settings themselves. And actually, you know what you got to do is actually click on the website itself to get these. And where are you, ISAPI? There we go. The ISAPI filters here. If we double click on them, here are all the runtimes and the actual filters that they go to. So these are the runtimes that are enabled for IIS API here, and this is just what IIS comes installed with. You know, it should come installed all the way up to the current version that's available to it at the time. So just some extra things that you can see here, but again here, ASP.NET settings are all up here for the site or application, and then IIS settings are down here for the sites. All right, so let's get our website in here. All right, we want to get our website deployed to this application so we can start viewing it through the browser. So let's head back over to our project. And back in here, we have our copy website utility here. And again, I got here just by right-clicking on the project and heading over to copy website. That opened this up. Now we can connect right to our local IIS here. You can also connect to an FTP site, a remote site. We just have our local server available to us here, so we're going to connect to our nuggetlab.com. Here's our demos virtual directory, and here is our application that contains our folder where all these files are going to go under. So let's hit open there. And that's going to open it up. See that? So I don't open it up. Now we can just highlight everything here and push it over there. And I'm just going to hit apply to all here. For some reason, there's already a web.config file in there. So we're just going to use the source here to overwrite it. And there we go. Everything was uploaded to the site. Now if we go back to IIS, we hit refresh here. And we can go to a content view. That's the difference here. Features view are just your configuration settings. Content view is the actual files inside of this virtual directory or application in this case. And that's it. No directories underneath here, so we just have some files in here. Now let's try to view one. So if we right click on default.aspx and hit browse, we're going to get an error. Why is that? And you can kind of decipher these messages by looking at the source error here. Target framework equals 4.0. We didn't register the .NET Framework 4.0. So we need to do that, and not only do we need to do that, but we need to tie the app pool for this application to use .NET 4.0. So how this will work then is anything inside of this application, all of our demos are done in .NET 4. So what we could do is really we should probably every application in here, or every demo that we put in here, then would be an application that'll be tied to the .NET 4 framework. And then maybe we have a website underneath the root here with all of our websites, all the virtual directories with all the pages in them, that'll then be tied to .NET 2. So we'll have a website that has some stuff running in the .NET 2 engine, some stuff running in the .NET 4. So let's do that. Let's get .NET 4 registered here for Internet Information Services. I'm just going to go to Start. I'm going to go right to it just to show you here. Let's just hit CMD, get a command window up, and then let's just browse right to where this is. I'll just kind of do this the manual way to show you where it is. So if we go to our C drive, head over to Windows, go down to C:\Windows, we need to go to the Microsoft.NET, wherever that is. There it is, Microsoft.NET. Let's go to the framework 4.0, and inside of here you have the ASP.NET _regIIS.exe. So let's just drag this into the command window, hit enter, and it'll give us all of the command line here options that we have. And what we want to do here is just simply register this. So if we run this with the -I switch, it's going to install this version of ASP.NET and update the configuration at the root level to use this version of ASP.NET. So we could also do an IR here, which is probably what we should do, since if this is an existing web server, we don't want to mess with the default version of ASP.NET. So we probably just want to hit the IR. So let's do that. Let's try this again. I'm going to hit the up arrow /IR, and there we go. Now it's started installing ASP.NET 4.0, and now it's done. So now, if we add in here, look at our app pools, check it out. Now we've got 4.0 and 4.0 Classic available to us. So what we want to do is go to our application, right-click, or you can also actually just hit our basic settings over here, and select our application pool to run in 4.0. We hit OK again. Now let's browse and see what happens. I'm going to right-click. Actually, let's just go right into our content view here. Right-click on our default.aspx, browse for it. What do we get? Hopefully not an error. Hey, look at that. There we are. So we're running this right through the web server. As you can see here, HTTP localhost, port 81, demos, name of our application directory there, and then default.aspx. So we're not running through Visual Studios. We're running right through the web server, and we can access this page in our application here, our web application, right through the web server. Now, one thing I want to mention is you don't have to do this the hard way by hunting and pecking through your directories to find ASP.NET regIIS. If you have the full version of Visual Studio installed, it comes with the Visual Studio command line, and you'll see that right in the directory structure. And it just has all of the tools here available to you. So you could fire up, the Visual Studio 2010 command line and just type in ASP.NET _regIIS, and it would do the same thing. All right, so I just wanted to kind of point that out there. It's not available in the Express editions, which is why we kind of had to do this the hard way, the manual way. And then the other thing I did want to mention as well here is rather than use this copy website utility, this is a good utility to use if your remote website is truly remote. It's pretty easy to do it this way, just to connect right to it, because you have this nice dialog that you can use up here to if you need to hit an FTP site or if you need to hit a remote site. So it's an easy way to do it. Nice clean dialog to access it with. But if everything's local, you can just simply copy and paste the files right into your virtual directory or application directory. You don't have to do all this stuff. It may be overkill at this point, because you can just head on over to your folder and copy all your files in there. So that's another way to do it. Alright, so in this nugget, we took a look here at web hosting. We started off with just some concepts here around web hosting, specifically Internet Information Services, Microsoft's software that turns a server into a web server. We took a look at what websites are, applications, and virtual directories. Those three major components that we're going to be working with every day in IIS if you're a web developer and you work with web hosting and deploying your websites. And then we just jumped into a big demo here and got you familiar with how to create these websites, set some configuration points up, how to work with applications, application pools, and virtual directories. Then I showed you here how you could copy your website or web application into IIS and make it available to the world. I hope this has been informative for you, and I thank you for viewing.